Live and local, it's the Drive Guys. Watch the show on youtube.com/Sactown Sports 1140.
Or listen on the Sactown Sports app.
Back here on the Drive Guys, Sactown Sports 1140, Drapes and CG. Talking Niners and, of course, the Sacramento Kings and the latest with Lauri Markkanen. Time to bring in our special guest here, who you can see on the YouTube chat right now. Coming to us from Salt Lake City, I would imagine, Tim Monemayor of the Monty Show. Tim, thanks for jumping on. You're on with Drapes and CG. How you doing today?
Exceptionally well. How are you, boys?
We're good, man. I'm trying to figure out what my guy Danny Ainge is doing out there in Salt Lake City. I worked with Danny in Boston for 11 years. He was known as Trader Danny. He never lost a deal, it seemed like. Is he botching this Lauri Markkanen situation?
No, I think that's one of the perceptions, but the reality is that this is about the ownership of the Utah Jazz. You got to remember that this is a team that just probably laid down close to $1 billion to acquire the Phoenix, Arizona Coyotes that are now the Utah Hockey Club. I mean, there is a massive investment from Ryan Smith, who is the billionaire owner, supposedly, of the Utah Jazz. And he is in saving mode. There's no doubt about this. And you need to look no further than where the Utah Jazz below the minimum. They have not, to this point, spent enough money to meet the minimum salary requirement that gets you that, the luxury tax sharing that goes on in this league. And the obvious implication here is that they're going to sign Lauri Markkanen to a significant extension that's going to get him to that floor. If they do keep him, which I think now they're almost certainly going to. But this is not a Danny Ainge thing. And you know what? If you know Danny at all, you know he is as competitive as anybody, and he wants to win. This is not a young man, by the way, I would point out, Danny Ainge. He came in to be, I'm not going to say a savior, but he came in to change the fortunes of the Utah Jazz. And not unlike the old-time Sacramento Kings who sputtered and are we a basketball team? That's not who Danny Ainge is. He's the Boston Celtics guy. And I think he's probably more frustrated than anybody that he's got two hands tied behind his back right now.
Tim, one of the things that gets lost when you have a popular player, a talented player, a lot of discussion, both probably on your show, in the paper there, and what have you, is the fans. The fans' voices get lost, except if you're reading social media. So as you look at the fans, the folks that are calling you and talking to you, what's the temperature in the room with them when they hear about the possibility that Lauri Markkanen might not be in Salt Lake City?
Cooper Flag, that's the temperature of the Utah Jazz fan. And let's be honest, if that's what this club was solely focused on, you could almost understand it. But if Cooper Flag was what you were solely focused on, Lauri Markkanen would already be wearing a Dubs uniform. This would be a done deal. But that's not what they're focused on. And I think, again, not to be redundant, but you got to remember, this isn't a team that drafts well in Utah. The Jazz don't develop talent well. It's going to be very difficult for you to go back through the history books of the Utah Jazz and find somebody in the modern era where they've drafted them, developed them, signed them to a max extension, and they've become an all-NBA performer. That doesn't exist in Jazz land. So you're not spending money, and you got to remember here as well, it's not just Lauri Markkanen. It's Jordan Clarkson. It's Colin Sexton. You have veterans on this team that are going to take up valuable minutes of young guys that you're supposedly going all in on in hopes of what I would think you are trying to do is get Cooper Flag. But the tragedy here for the fans is their frustration that there is no clear-cut direction for a really bad basketball team that does not win games. You don't know, are we all in on Cooper Flag? Are we all in on trying to make a playoff spot? That's certainly because you're not making the playoffs with this roster, but you're also not getting Cooper Flag with this roster. But it's enjoyable at least to pay an exorbitant amount of money to watch a bad basketball team that features Lauri Markkanen, who is truly been a renaissance man wearing a Jazz uniform.
Man, that's some good stuff you're saying
Yeah.
there, Tim, because I could just imagine the struggle that Danny Ainge and Ryan Smith are going with right now. Do you believe if it was up to Danny, he would rip it down to the studs and tank for flag? Is that what you think?
No, I think if it was up to Danny, we would stop talking about how many draft assets and how much cap space the Jazz have, because he'd be paying the luxury tax. Because in this league, that's essentially what you have to do to win. The Boston Celtics just made Jason Tatum the highest paid player in the history of basketball after winning a championship. Everybody, if you look at the history of Golden State and they're winning, they drafted and then they got KD and they spent money and they supplemented and they paid guys. If Danny Ainge, and again, you know this as well as anybody, I would think, Danny Ainge wants to win. You've got to draft well and you've got to pay money to good players to do so. If Danny Ainge were in control here, I think he would have already traded multiple draft picks because they've got a plethora.
Right.
And we'd be talking about a very different build of a Utah Jazz team. Now, if we're talking about August 5th, 2024, at this point you're in a jackpot because you don't have one direction that you can easily go and pick and say, okay, we're going to Cooper Flag, call Golden State, we've got to trade Lauri Markkanen. But that now it feels like you're almost too late. You've lost some leverage there. So if I were Danny Ainge, and if what I think Danny would do is, I think he'd get aggressive. I would have to believe he also would not have traded Donovan Mitchell at that point, because I'm not even sure that. And for those of you who don't remember, Lauri Markkanen came in the Donovan Mitchell trade.
Yep.
That was not the most popular move at the time, because Lauri Markkanen was an average player at that point. He was not some special guy, if you remember. And as a Chicagoan and a diehard Chicago Bulls fan, trust me when I say there was a level of disappointment with Lauri when he was in Chicago that continued to Cleveland. So it's an interesting situation for sure.
Tim, I have to tell you, I don't want to break the flow here, but I was going to say this a minute ago. I'm just listening to you. You and I have never spoken before, and I'm born and raised in Chicago, and I'm listening to you, and I'm thinking, okay, he's got to be from Chicago. Tim has to be. I'm hearing it. Okay, because I was born and raised on the North Side. I'm hearing it, man. I'm loving it. I knew it. I knew it.
Hello, Rogers Park, Illinois.
Yeah, yes, that was my man. That was my neighborhood. Estes Avenue out in Sheridan. Hey, the Danny Ainge has been there since 21, I believe. When you look at, you're right. He's a winner. He's always been a winner. When you look at the plan as you know it, do you buy into the plan? Is there a 5-year plan, a 10-year plan, or is it just like whatever I have to do, the plan is to win as early as possible?
No, that's not the plan. I wish that were the plan. It's a heck of a lot more enjoyable to cover sports in Salt Lake City when the Jazz are good. I'll be honest with you. I think the plan is to spend as little money as possible and tell a story that you're trying to compete. I think that's the plan. Again, Ryan Smith is a guy who came in with a lot of hope, the owner of the Jazz. Everybody's heard of Qualtrics by this point. I think he's that guy who lives in an apartment and drives a Lamborghini. He's got a lot of assets on the bottom line. He doesn't have a lot of cash, in my opinion. I think this NHL deal probably leveraged him. And I think he is somebody that's not going to outlay money. Because, again, I simply ask for the casual Jazz observer or NBA observer, you probably don't realize that Ryan Smith has never put pen to paper on a big contract in the NBA. He approved Rudy Gobert's the worst contract in the history of the NBA at the time. He approved that Rudy Gobert extension. He'd owned the team for like 12 minutes when it was handed to him. He had no choice but to approve that. He didn't sign Donovan Mitchell to a massive extension and build around him. He traded, and the Rudy Gobert trade had to happen. The two hated each other. Rudy's a liability in the playoffs. Totally get it. But then from there, you just tore this thing apart and you've never rebuilt it. And all you talk about is draft assets and we have cap space and we're never going to do anything with it because dollars to donuts, who wants to bet win totals on the NHL team? Who wants to bet that team is competitive? Because the other thing you got to remember about Salt Lake City, it's not like this is a town where, like, my God, we've got to have NHL. You know, like, it's not like those guys are excited about it.
Hey, Tim, you know, I'm listening to you, and this is like, you know, earth-shattering news to me. Because when I come to Salt Lake, I see Ryan there. I see him courtside, see him with his family. You know, he's, you know, at least I thought, one of the young, flashy, you know, like exciting owners. Now it sounded like, listening to you, you know, things may be tight. Do the fans understand that there in Utah, and have they started to turn on him a little bit?
It's interesting. Ryan Smith very much controls the media here. Ryan is a guy that is a member of the member of the LDS Church. So the flagship station is owned by the LDS Church, KSL. You guys are aware of that.
Yep.
He does not get questioned by the newspapers here. He does not get questioned by TV stations here. When he goes on a show, a national show, and pick your flavor of show that you want to point to, they don't ask him hard questions because they don't know the questions to ask him. So he very much is in control of his narrative, which is a great place to be, right? It's a great place to be. But my point is, when you look at the fan perspective on Ryan Smith, there's nobody asking him hard questions. There's nobody holding him accountable. This is a college football town unless the Jazz are good. The Jazz are not good, so now we're talking about the Utah Utes, and we're talking about BYU football and the NFL, and you know that. So he kind of gets a free pass. He's very much under the radar, and it's hard to change that, because when he's good, everybody loves him. When he's bad, nobody talks about him. So there's no heat, I guess is the right way to say that. Again, I'm a Chicago guy. They are Tom Ricketts, the owner of the Cubs. Let's not forget that situation. Or think about if the Lake Cubs burned it down and traded your Steph Curry. Or think about if the Kings turned around and gave away, instead of buying, they were selling, and they sold everybody, right? Yeah. Like, that's what you've done here, and nobody's complaining about it.
Don't get me started on Reinsdorf. I'm listening to you, and I, you know, we all do this for a living, and I'm hearing, and understandably so, a tinge of anger in your voice. And as you mentioned Ryan Smith, Tim, is there a trepidation to figuratively back him up to a wall and give him some heat because there's a concern about getting access? Or, I mean, I'm trying to figure this out because it's fascinating what you're saying.
Yeah, I think when you look at Ryan Smith here, he very much is untouchable. He is a BYU grad, which is huge in the state of Utah. He funds BYU athletics. He has the hockey team. He's got the radio stations. He owns a piece of the MLS franchise, Real Salt Lake. And, of course, he owns the Jazz. If you are the main sports players in this town, there's no benefit for you questioning him, because you will get locked out. You will. That's the harsh reality. It's a very different landscape. And I go back to the fall of the Maloofs in Sacramento. You go from Chris Webber and Mike Bibby to, well, we're going to move this team, and Carmichael Dave driving an RV to New York City. And you think about how that fall happened, right? I don't imagine that Ryan Smith will ever be having Carmichael Dave drive an RV to New York City again, right? But I can't imagine a scenario where he puts a foot wrong that would ever put him there, because there's nobody that's willing to, again, to make the analogy, drive the RV. There's nobody willing to question. There's nobody willing to go after him in the mainstream media, because he signs their checks. They work for him. So it's awfully difficult to put yourself in that position.
So what's and you mentioned this and talked about this, what's the path ahead for the Jazz? Because I look at your roster, how come Clarkson hasn't been moved? How come John Collins, who I would love here in Sacramento, How come he hasn't moved? You have these veteran assets that, can help you win, yes, but then they cost money and you're not in the Cooper Flag sweepstakes. So how come some of the other players haven't been moved?
Jordan Clarkson was a Ryan Smith good friend. Jordan Clarkson, when they rolled out the new uniforms 2 years ago, was the model for those. Instead of Donovan Mitchell, it was Jordan Clarkson. Ryan Smith, according to those in the know, intervened and wanted to pay Jordan Clarkson. So Jordan didn't opt out of his deal. And now when they want to trade him, he has no value. That's the biggest issue. John Collins, I think John Collins is the one player they would like to move most. But you have a younger head coach who hasn't been able to leverage John Collins to the level that you need to. John Collins is a phenomenal rebounder. And if you teach him to do something other than shoot threes in the corner, he's a player that you can leverage. I agree. If you put him in Sacramento, if you put him on a high-level team that needs a rebound and outlet guy who can play in a young athletic rotation, I think John Collins, his ceiling is much higher than we've seen here. But again, this goes back to the direction, because you're looking at somebody in Ryan Smith who's taking taxpayer dollars. Understand that the hockey team is being taxpayer funded. The arena, the downtown district, that hockey team has to win. But I think he's a little worried about trading every single veteran he has, because nobody's going to come to Jazz games. At least now the building will be half full, maybe half full. For NBA, it'll be jam-packed. They're on a waiting list for the NHL. I just think Ryan Smith, he's caught in this no man's land. And he's going to re-sign Lauri Markkanen. He's going to spend the bare minimum. And I think they are going to play their way out of a Cooper Flag derby, in my opinion.
Strong stuff from Tim Monemayor, of the Monty Show out there in Salt Lake City. You can always check him out. Tim, on your last point you just made, and you know this as well as I do, it sounds like the Jazz are going to be in no man's land. I came into this conversation thinking, all right, if they don't trade Markkanen, maybe they're buyers. Maybe they try to go out there and get Brandon Ingram. Maybe they try to make another deal. But listening to you, it's like Ryan Smith is okay with being 11th, 12th in the Western Conference.
No problem. Because he's not going to pay a higher salary, right? And a guy like Brandon Ingram, who doesn't play a lot of games, he's often injured, and he wants a lot of money. That's exactly the wrong guy for Ryan Smith, right? Like he's not going to go pay a big money guy who, and this is the Jonathan Kuminga conundrum, if you will. Jonathan Kuminga is up for a significant extension. I've got that guy on my roster if I'm Danny Ainge and Lauri Markkanen, but a better version of him, and I can sell that to my fans. But if you bring Jonathan Kuminga here, you better develop him, and this organization has zero track record of developing him. So you go and make a trade, you go and get a Brandon Ingram, or you go trade Lauri Markkanen, your life gets more difficult. If you're Ryan Smith, in my opinion, your life gets more difficult. It doesn't get easier. And signing Lauri Markkanen to an extension, it just means you can't trade him this season unless he were to sign it, like on the 6th.
Right. If
he signs it Friday, Saturday, or 2 weeks from now, that just means next summer you have to wait to trade him till next summer. But they will trade Lauri Markkanen. They will not pay the total value of that contract. That would be shocking.
Wow.
I think it's 25-30% chance that they trade him before the season. I think it's more 70% he signs a renegotiated deal for this year to get him max eligible. And then I think they wind up trading him next offseason.
So how, Tim, if that in fact plays out, you just pulled that out of the crystal ball. It makes sense. I see it. Can the Utah Jazz, whatever happens after that, can they still figure out a way, and I know I'm asking you to look in the future, of getting out of the Western Conference without a Lauri Markkanen on their squad?
I can't imagine it.
Yeah.
I can't imagine. I think it's such a longer timeline. I mean, I don't know. I don't even know what that would take. Like, you would have to have a completely different set of players at that point. I mean, if you have to be all in on Cooper Flag. That's a generational Victor Wembanyama type talent. If you're not going to compete for a playoff spot, and they will not, you have to do everything you can do. I would think at some point this season, John Collins is gone. Colin Sexton has real attainable trade value. You've got to move these guys. And if you do sign Lauri Markkanen to a contract, what's the best case scenario? Are you signing him to a contract to try and win, or are you paying Lauri Markkanen to play 40 games? Because you cannot get anywhere near a play-in. You need to be the worst team in the Western Conference at a minimum. I don't even know how this plays out in a good way, let alone getting out of the Western Conference.
So then the quick follow-up for you, Tim, is if you're all in, the Utah Jazz, if you're all in on the Cooper Flag sweepstakes, can Ryan Smith, does he have the kind of temperament or the understanding that we're going to have to lose? We're going to have to lose a lot. We're going to have to get the best chance to get the number one pick in the lottery. Is he okay with that?
He cares an awful lot about what people think of him. His reputation matters to him. I think it's why they're going to sign Lauri Markkanen to an extension. It's why Jordan Clarkson's still here. It's why you are, in my opinion, it's why you don't do interviews with people who are going to ask you questions, because I think he doesn't want to ever give the perception that he's doing anything less than everything he can do to win games. When those of us that have watched this sport for 30 years and I've covered the Bulls and the Lakers at their best, this isn't anywhere near everything you can do to win games. So I think he cares what people think of him.
Wow, man, Tim, this is some great stuff. Final question for you, Tim. Appreciate you coming on, Tim Monemayor of the Monty Show. I got to go back to John Collins, because anybody that listens to the Drive Guys here on Sactown Sports 1140 knows I've been beating that drum for about 3 or 4 months now. I think he's a perfect fit. Why do you think he has not been dealt? And is his value low? Have they devalued him in Utah? What do you think it would take to get him? Like, I'd drive there right now. I'd pull a Carmichael Dave, hop in my Winnebago, and head over to Salt Lake City and get John Collins right now. What's the deal with that guy?
I think that he is, what is he owed? $53 million. Next year's a player option.
Yep,
I think Danny Ainge is doing what he's done for a couple of summers in a row. He's put a pause button on the NBA trade market at this moment. I think there's a real likely chance they would move him. Danny always has a ridiculously high trade demand. I think it would take a first-round pick. And I do think I'm with you on John Collins. I really like him. The $26 million number, I think he's $26.5 million a year for the next 2 years. I think it's a big number for contending teams. Like, again, Golden State doesn't have the cap space to do that, right? So I think dance partners are difficult. And John Collins is somebody who likes to shoot threes. And you need him to play inside of the three-point arc. You need him to rebound. And I think he is fully capable of doing that. He's shown you that. But I think it would take a first round pick at a minimum. And because the Jazz are so low in salary, they don't have a lot of salary. You're going to have to find a couple of contracts that make that deal work, as you would have to, obviously. But you need to meet the minimum so that the Jazz are spending enough money on salaries when the deadline gets here. And what is that, October?
Good stuff from Tim Monemayor. Tim, appreciate you coming on the show. You can follow him on Twitter, The Monty Show, at The Monty Show. Great stuff as always, Tim. We're going to have to do it again, man, once this trade is done, once John Collins comes to Sacramento, all right?
All right, guys. Good to see you.
That's great, man.
All right, appreciate it. Tim Monemayor. Follow him on The Monty Show. He's on YouTube as well.
Dance partners are difficult.
They are.
I love that phrase.
And we'll talk more about that. We'll get the Sacramento Kings fans' reaction as well. Hit us up, 916-339-1140. Lauri Markkanen looks like he's staying for now in Utah, but the Kings were close to acquiring him. Kings fans, are you happy that we didn't? And we stuck with DeMar DeRozan. We'll get your calls plus more here on the Drive Guys, Sactown Sports 1140.
Jason Mraz and the Super Band.